I think we can start. My name is Savelo Jendlo Vukacheni. I'm here, the chair of epistemologies of the Global South, and it is a great pleasure and indeed honor to welcome all of you to this 7th seminar in a series of monthly seminars on the theme of the changing African idea of Africa and the future of African studies. This is a collaborative work or project that my chair here at the University of Bayreuth, together with the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, conceived in 2021, but it commenced in April 2022. It is also part of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose mandate is to advance the agenda of reconfiguring African studies. And these seminars are also part of our regular keynote knowledge lab events organized around the questions of methodology, theory, and the reflexive African studies. Today, we are so delighted to host Dr. Godwin Murunga, the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science in Africa, based in Dakar in Senegal. Dr. Murunga is a well-known scholar, a historian and a political analyst, a former director of the African Leadership Center, and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. But besides being a scholar in his own right, Dr. Murunga also carries the burden of the Codesria, which is a premier institute, which has since establishment in 1973 been on the forefront of generation of Africa-centered and Pan-African knowledge. And they were really privileged to have the Executive Secretary of Codesria delivering the 7th seminar in our series today. The topic is reconfiguring African studies with a question mark. When I talked to Murunga, he said, we need to put a question mark after that. I will know why. But that's what we said then, but we'd already advertised without a question mark. But before I call on Dr. Murunga to deliver the seminar, I want also to inform you that our regular partner, Dr. Bongani Ngolunga, who is the director of the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study, is not with us today because of other commitments. He normally, I will introduce, then Bongani will handle the question and answer. But because he's not here, we'll ask Robert, and Robert has graciously accepted to chair the question and answer. And with these few words, welcome, Godwin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabelo, both for the invitation, but also for the persistence in making sure that we associate not just me, but Codesria with the extremely interesting work, excellent work that the chair in epistemologies of the Global South has been doing. I am grateful for the invitation, but I'm also grateful that the invitation came in the context of the work that is being done around the Africa Multiple Cluster. Some of the colleagues who are online will know that in the process of developing the thinking around the work of the Africa Multiple Cluster, CODESRIA was invited to the initial discussions in Bayreuth. And I was lucky to be able to attend and, listen to the thinking that was going there. So some of the thoughts that will go into this seminar are actually informed by my understanding and thinking as I joined into and participated in the planning around the Africa Multiple Cluster. I would also, before I go ahead, like to register by acknowledgement of the partner, the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Johannesburg. I am associated with the University of Johannesburg in some way, having been a visiting fellow there. And so I'm really grateful that this particular program and this seminar is jointly sponsored by the two institutions. When I reviewed the work that you've been doing, and especially in the context of the seminar on the theme, the changing African idea of Africa and the future of African studies. I took note of the fact that you have had a really stellar cast of colleagues making presentation to this, and I owe quite a bit of what I'm going to talk about to thinking that I have listened to from them. And a few of these colleagues actually have been associated with CODESRIA in a number of ways. Achille Mbembe, Elisio Makamo, Toyin Falola, among the presenters you've had to date, are associated with CODESRIA in different ways. In their presentations, some of which I participated, listened online, they focused and provided detailed commentary on the first part of the theme of your work, the changing African idea of Africa. I'm going to spend a lot more time to develop an argument about the future of African studies. The thoughts I'm going to share are informed by a whole range of experiences, some of them personal, some of them that I have read about. But I want to underscore two important points about the experiences that inform my presentation. The first, and perhaps most important, is that I'm the executive secretary of CODESRIA, one of the leading organizations for the study, one of the leading organizations in the social sciences and humanities in Africa, based in Dakar, an organization that will be 50 years old in roughly 3 months. An organization that has, in its programming, touched virtually each and every country on the continent. An organization that runs one of the longest surviving journals in the social sciences in Africa. Our premier journal is going to volume 48 next year. We just released volume 47, number 3. We're going to release volume 47, number 4, in a matter of months. And by the analysis of some of our colleagues, if you pick up copies of, say, 3 to 4 leading Africanist journals in North America and Europe, and you count the number of Africans, especially those based on the continent who are published there, Codesria's Africa Development has published more Africans than 3 to 4 leading Africanist journals in Europe and North America. An organization that does all these things while also having to survive the difficult terrain of navigating the higher education landscape in Africa, a landscape that by every measure is underfunded, a landscape that by every measure gets often disrupted, not by the refusal of governments to put resources to support higher education in Africa, but actually by external policy shocks that make it extremely difficult for universities across the continent to survive. And Codesria has to draw the community of scholarship out of this, which is the reason why I want to foreground the fact that my presentation is informed by 5 years of leading this organization, engaging African scholars across the continent, but by slightly over 20 years of being a member of Codesria, serving on its executive committee for a total of 6 years. The second most important element of that informs my study is that while I have the privilege of doing all this work through Codesria, I actually trained for my graduate studies in North America, precisely at Northwestern University for a period of 5 years, attended one of the leading programs of African studies in the US, if you will, was trained by professors who themselves made the life of their program of African studies at Northwestern what we know it to be. And essentially, therefore, adequately socialized in the nature of graduate studies in the US. With the advantages that brings, with the influence that brings, I feel that I have to ask the question: do we really need to reconfigure African studies? Is that what we are looking for? Because there is no African studies to speak about in Africa. And where there is, the mission, the idea of studying Africa in much of the African higher education landscape does not carry the same logic as African studies as practiced mainly in North America, but to a large extent also in certain places in Europe. So that becomes the critical question that we have to deal with. Do we really want to reconfigure African studies? And my experience both as a student at Northwestern University and as the executive secretary of Codesria leads me to accept the conclusion that there is a very wide gap, a very wide gulf, if you will, between the African studies that is conducted in North America and parts of Europe, and the African studies or even the African experience of itself on the continent. Now this, of course, then begins to raise rather difficult questions. And my presentation is going to attempt to talk about these difficult questions in a manner that does not pretend to be new I think there have been very many discussions about the future of African studies, but in a manner that wants to hang on to what I think is the core of what the problem is and the reason why we must ask the question, do we want to reconfigure African studies? I also want to begin by inserting a caveat that I will try to develop the argument around notions of power and power structure, so that at the end of the day, we are all involved in African studies in our own individual ways, but we contribute to a system of thinking about Africa that at the end of the day, we need to question it. And so the commentary, unless I make direct reference to particular persons whom I've read or engaged or any of those, is really about the overall structure that structures how we engage Africa in our own work. I am also aware that different schools and different centers for the study of Africa in Europe and in North America do different things and are driven by different orientations. Some extremely liberal, some extremely progressive, some extremely key in developing in a nice way creative insurgency against African studies as is conceived and constituted and done in North America and in Europe. And others that are a lot more conservative, are willing to drive an idea of Africa that sits at the extreme odd of what we know. But underlying all this is a structure that connects them and makes it impossible for us to make significant progress in bridging the gap I have acknowledged and that I think does exist between the way we study Africa in the global north and the way we study and live Africa in our own contexts. And the conclusion I'm going to arrive at is provocative. My sense is that we do not need to reconfigure African studies. We need a thoroughly disruptive process that goes to the core of what is problematic about African studies as it's presently constituted. And begin to imagine different ways for doing African studies. But that imagination, I want to insist, must be driven with Africa and Africans at the center of it, for reasons that I will highlight in the next couple of minutes. African studies as is presently constituted, especially in North America and in Europe, and I need you to remember the caveat I've said that I know there's a diversity in that geography, is built around a racial power structure. And this racial power structure is largely white and male at the top, and the hierarchy goes down in that way. What I'm saying is not new. It's been repeatedly mentioned in a whole series of engagements, including some very brilliant interventions in quote unquote what they call the leading association for the study of Africa in the US, the African Studies Association. As I was sampling the presidential addresses published in the African Studies Review, I could see at least 8 of them very quickly that raise this question of power hierarchies based on race and gender, and that seek an argument to reform African studies as it is. But the point that needs to be made, in addition to the fact that that African studies as is constituted is built on a white power structure, rightly white male power structure, needs to be clear that its very existence has depended on displacing other ideas, other notions of African studies that either existed prior to the founding of African studies in the US in particular, or notions of African studies that exist in other places that have not enjoyed quite as much attention as what we have in our context. So Africa has been studied in many, many other places other than in Western Europe and North America. There are traditions for the study of Africa in Asia, Japan, India, China. In fact, a significant amount of those. Is there a problem?
No, it's fine. Continue.
Okay. Those traditions for the study of Africa with different orientations have been displaced partly by the fact that the African studies as presently constituted in North America and in much of Europe was born as an enterprise of displacement of other notions. The one we know about more is the tradition of African studies that existed and continues to exist today in historically Black universities and colleges in the US itself, with centers for the study of Africa dotted across that terrain. So displacement, in my view, was the first act of colonizing the idea of Africa and the study of Africa. That displacement has had serious repercussions for what notion of Africa dominates the landscape. The second act, other than displacement, was to frame what one would call African studies as an Africanist enterprise. Melville Haskowitz, sitting in Evanston, I believe, made this argument very powerfully on the basis of the fact of science, the notion of science that emphasized objectivity, and in the case of African studies, essentially argued that distance from the object of study informs the kind of objectivity that goes with it, and therefore the credibility that the knowledge that is produced bears. And in her presidential lecture, I believe in 2018 or thereabout, Jean Ullman makes a very sound argument about how this in itself became a justification for entrenching a very specific notion of African studies built, as I said, on a power structure that is white and male. But perhaps even more disturbing is the fact that going back to the notion of displacement, that Melville Haskowitz himself was in fact a beneficiary of initial association with notions of Africa, notions of African studies that were existing in historically Black universities and college, including those ones that were discussed at Howard University. Many of his compatriots and eventually people whom he worked with had developed a totally different notion of African studies. So the act of displacement and the framing of an Africanist enterprise becomes central to the African studies that we engage today. And more importantly, I believe, the emergence of this notion of African studies as indispensable to understanding Africa. Indispensable to understanding Africa, not just by others who study Africa, but occasionally it is pushed to the limits, to the point where it is also a notion that asserts indispensability for Africans, that Africans cannot really know Africa unless they engage this notion of African studies that prevails. So that African studies as is presently constituted essentially begins to assume the character of a gate or a compound for which entry is based on whether you understand this particular idea of Africa that I'm describing. The myth of indispensability becomes very central to convincing everyone that this is the Africa that we need and this myth of indispensability is now believed not just in African studies as exercised abroad, but also within Africa itself. I think it's a former World Bank president, if I'm not wrong, who in a moment of candid engagement made the point, which has repeatedly been cited, that in the 1980s into the 1990s, there were more foreign experts on Africa than there ever were colonial administrators in the colonial time. A remarkable point quantitatively, partly because it suggests we live in a continent that has a self-doubt about its capacity to think about dealing with its own internal matters. Now, the strength of Africa, this notion of African studies that we deal with, is built around also a complementary structure to that white power structure. This structure defines and reproduces the power and inequality of African studies as presently constituted. That structure comes full with the institutional basis. After the 1950s, largely historically white universities in the US. In Europe, there were different centers for the study of Africa, specializing in different things that did not necessarily tie in the manner in which the historically white universities in the US have come through. So my emphasis on historically white universities, including the university that I went to for my graduate studies, is very indicative of the diversity of centers for the study. But the university in North America in particular becomes a very useful structure around which to build an idea of Africa that supports a particular power structure that remains key. And the advantages that come with it, if you, for instance, are at Northwestern University, you are at UCLA, California, you are in Boston, where there's a long-standing Center for African Studies, you are at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The advantage you enjoy there cannot, for instance, be compared to the advantage that you have in a historically Black university or college. It's supported by a network of individuals, many of whom play a leading role in shaping this particular notion of African studies that I'm talking about. Here, even the vocabulary is indicative. The vocabulary is indicative of the kind of structure that is being built with generous emphasis and difference, if you will, to particular scholars described either as leading scholars in African studies. Their books are described as leading books in African studies and all that. And the associated vocabulary is in many cases disarming of what other alternative interventions that people would want to make in relation to these African studies. And in doing that disarming, one takes note of the fact that hierarchies will then be a central component to the kind of pillars that support this notion of African studies, and that those hierarchies reinforce each other in intricate ways, either publicly through the networks and associations that facilitate the study of Africa, mostly in North America, partly in Western Europe, but also they legitimize what kind of knowledge carries the weight in the context for the study of Africa, so that concepts, vocabularies become routinized and exercise a central influence in what idea of Africa begins to prevail. In a context where, when you come with notions of shifting the center, or the work that you yourself, Sabelo, has done regarding epistemic justice, you have to undertake the work of dealing with the vocabulary and the concepts and the hierarchies that inform many of these things that we're talking about. And of course, collectively reinforced by associations for the study of Africa in much of Western Europe and in much of North America, some of which become the definitive places where we go to renew our faith and where we go to reinvent ourselves. And this is important to me because I am an observer of the annual pilgrimages that many African academics make to wherever the next conference for the African Studies Association, for instance, is going to be held. And what is remarkable to me is the extent to which, given the importance associated with those sites of renewal and all that, the extent, the trouble to which many African academics go through just to be able to make it to the next annual meeting of some of the associations for the study of Africa abroad, with all the difficulties for visa, with all the difficulties for finding tickets and all that. Many African academics have actually turned attending some of these meetings as an annual pilgrimage they have to make in order to, and this demonstrates the value, but also it demonstrates how a notion of African studies that is dominant has definitively established itself. Many African academics will not pay to come to a meeting of CODESRIA. Literally in CODESRIA, we have to find resources to pay for them to attend many of our meetings. But they will do everything to maintain their membership of associations in the global north, and they will do everything to attend those annual meetings. It doesn't matter how much of a hurdle you place in relation to access to visa and related things. And of course, this African studies is also facilitated most importantly by two additional things: a funding network that is key to its survival and sustainability, and also by networks of knowledge production and dissemination, and knowledge production, publishing and dissemination that is actually central to the future growth in terms of their careers. I'll speak about funding a little later, only to put a note to this, that for the notion of African studies that we deal with to establish itself, funding played a key role in it. And I don't want to go into the story of how some of the existing foundations played a role in directing resources to some of these places while denying resources to the historically, the existing notion study of Africa in historically Black universities and colleges. And publishing has become key to this whole thing because it's important for career growth, for recognition, for legitimacy, for you to be able to figure out for you to be able to be recognized as an authority in this particular context. The thing that we have not paid attention to, I think, is the endurance and sustainability of this notion of Africa built on this particular white power structure. There have been repeated proclamations, I could not even track many of them, about this idea of African studies, the death of this idea of African studies. These repeated proclamations, some of them pronounced with a level of enthusiasm that perhaps is unmatched, have actually not been born out of the data that I was able to secure. And the question then that I wanted to ask is, what is the reason why these repeated proclamations about the death of African studies, as is presently constituted, what is the reason that they get it wrong? For instance, there were proclamations in the early 1960s. Many colleagues here will remember the African Studies Association meeting in Montreal, where there was almost an insurgency against African studies as was constituted, partly because not only had it displaced African studies conducted by African Americans and others, but it had actually made it very difficult for their voices to be heard. So the Montreal experience was very interesting. People would remember that Montreal, the African Studies Association of the US, meeting in Montreal was the first time that that association held a meeting outside the US. So Canada sounded to be the next, the only other place. There have been pronouncements about the death of African studies as presently constituted following the end of the Cold War. And there have been boycotts. In the case of the UK, there was actually a general boycott by Nigerian academics of one of the leading journals for the study of African history, the Journal of African History. In spite of all these attempts, African studies as presently constituted has survived, has endured, and all this. And the resilience of this idea of African studies, for me, is based on the fact that while there have been enormous attempts to change, to alter, to reform, both in terms of the associations, in terms of what happens in the journals, what happens in the universities that play a predominant role in African studies, we've never touched the power structure that informs the study of Africa in the manner in which we know it. So we tweak one thing here and there, and we try to reform it, but essentially it doesn't work. And it doesn't work partly because the manner in which the structure is constructed makes it almost impossible and difficult for you to disrupt or dismantle it sufficiently in a way as to change the idea of Africa that is being studied. This is because that power structure is designed to only experience minimal internal changes. Some of them are done on the basis of not on the basis of external pressure to change, but internal willingness to accept a select number of extremely critical voices and all that. So the power structure remains with minimal changes, and these changes are only changes that are acceptable, never going in many cases to altering the actual structure that gives life to this, so that at the end of the day, you can make the changes that you want, but there is remaining in place pillars that reinforce the primacy of hierarchies within the study of Africa, that silences non-conforming perspectives, that occasionally incorporates or co-opts critics who are vigorous and loud and might constitute a danger to particular ways of thinking about Africa. Occasionally allowing different shades of color against what largely would remain a white male background. And in many cases, sidestepping all creative attempts to alter that frame. And this is done in a whole range of cases. The one that really comes to mind is the persistent refusal in many instances to publish the works of people who write in a manner that is not quote unquote acceptable. Codesria has been lucky to rescue a range of manuscripts that had stayed on the shelves of publishing firms because the blind peer review has raised troubling questions because the work that has been presented for publication does not include the latest references from the leading thinkers, mostly from the global north in that particular manuscript. And on occasions when there is a need to be brutally honest, to just dismiss without really giving any good reason. All these are mechanisms, strategies that have played in making sure that the notion of African studies based on the power structure identified sidesteps all levels of creative insurgency to alter the force that drives African studies as we understand it. And in many cases, back to the point about the myth of indispensability, in many cases, re-emphasizing the inevitability of the Africanist enterprise to knowing Africa. And unfortunately, this inevitability is what I think the African policy actors buy in a lot, to the point where African scholars become second-grade contributors to policies within the continent simply by the fact that their work is not thought to be important in relation to the inevitable, credible, authorized, legitimate positions of key actors within the Africanist enterprise. As a result, the Africanist enterprise has continued to play an inordinate influence in the production of knowledge in Africa and beyond Africa in the global north. The material base that supports this, I think, needs to be a subject of intense discussion. The racial structure that informs this needs to be a topic of intense discussion. Serious anthropological work needs to go into this. The fact that there is an Africa that depends on knowledge produced for it by others should trouble not just Africans in Africa, but actually Africans everywhere. And it should trouble because the Africa then that we begin to engage differs in significant ways to the Africa that we know. Just about a month ago, we published an article, actually no, about 2 weeks ago, Codesria published an article on the notion of sub-Saharan Africa. A notion that is at the core of the idea of Africa that I'm talking about. You don't find too many places where the study of Africa as a continent includes North Africa. You don't find in many places a sufficient questioning and a displacement of the idea of Africa as that contraption to the south of the Sahara and to the north of Limpopo. Essentially removing South Africa because of the fact of apartheid, and on the other hand, North Africa because racially, at least it is thought to be lighter than. The fact of an Africa that is reduced to a subcategory that essentially then becomes subhuman, if you will. You know, the dehumanization and the derogatory connotations that go with this notion of Africa. You're not going to be able to deal with that unless you begin to acknowledge that the enterprise of Africa as understood and built around the Africanist enterprise is the problem, and that changing that structure is central to doing this. Now, part of the problem, I must say, also is that not only is the structure there, it also has a capacity to reproduce itself. So that every generation of African academics have had to deal with the notion of Africa that is in many cases alien to it. The capacity of the African enterprise to reproduce itself explains the resilience and endurance of African studies as is constituted today. And this capacity to reproduce remains largely understudied, and I'm making the case that we need to understand it a little more than we have, because the capacity to reproduce through training, graduate school, a community of scholarship that buys into this particular thinking about Africa is a central problem. And having studied at Northwestern, attended conferences both in the US and UK, participated as a visiting professor in some of the universities in Europe, one begins to see how that reproduction happens. Indeed, one of my colleagues, Wale Adebani, who is the, I think, director of the Center for African Studies at Oxford University, has done an interesting analysis of how the idea of Africa that prevails begins at the level of undergraduate studies, goes into graduate studies, and then finds life both in terms of postgraduate work, in terms of the tenure track system, if you are talking about the US, and in terms of how that system works to retain and enhance African studies understood in the context of the hierarchies of that male power structure that I'm talking about. But for me, more importantly also is the role of publishing and dissemination in this whole story. Some of us have talked about decolonizing African studies. Some of us have spent years really thinking through trying to establish alternative structures that are more collegial, more inclusive, that go beyond centering a particular racial characterization. The difficulty is that the processes put in place that enhance, determine, and project a particular idea of Africa are impenetrable in many cases. So that publishing networks play a significant role in this, but also, and perhaps this is most important, funding networks play a significant role in this. We live in a context where the reproduction of the community and the notion of Africa that I've spoken to is largely based on how much resources are put in place into some of these into these institutions. It depends on whether you can have a voice in the larger assembly where Africa is being discussed. So that publishing networks, publishing networks play this role. Many of the more visible, many of the networks for publishing that can be accessed easily are not on the continent. They are under the control of institutions that project a very particular understanding of what Africa is. And what this has done, there are very many consequences of this structure in publishing. But what this has done is that it has forced even Africans to begin to think about ways of entry, so that entryism, if you will, becomes perhaps the major preoccupation for anyone who wants to, to experience professional growth, but also for anyone who wants to engage in productive discussions about Africa in places that matter. When we hold Codesria institutes, one of the central complaints that we receive from African academics, Nigeria is a good example, South Africa has similar tendencies, is for professional growth, promotion from one position to the other within the university. Journals are categorized. And in Nigeria, there is a language of onshore and offshore journals. And there are a number of journals that you should have published in before you get promoted to be a professor or something like that. That a university in Nigeria would make an Africanist journal a core of the requirement for being promoted is to ask some of these young academics to commit suicide. Because the networks for publishing and the way they work in Europe and in the US, and I must say Germany is a bit unique in this story because the book publishing industry in Germany and the postgraduate framework, to the best of my understanding, is slightly different from many other places. But the point I'm making there is that, the requirement for publishing and all this is a point that one has to spend quite a bit of time worrying about, because it has blocked many Africans, many progressive thinkers, African or non-African, from being able to express themselves, mainly because of this. And the result has been that the notion of discourse, the idea of debating in African studies, often becomes a staging ground, if you will, for a reproduction of ideas about Africa that are essentially dehumanizing to Africa and Africans, that are essentially derogatory to Africa and Africans. And I don't want to go into the detailed examples, but as recent as June 2022, the African Studies Review published an article titled Autoethnography that was the cause of a major storm, leading many scholars to, especially African scholars, to mobilize to protest the publication of that particular article. I'm not sure that many of the people who participated in this were aware that this was just but the latest in a round of protests about articles that if you live and experience Africa, it goes to the heart of, it gives you the sense that you don't really qualify as a real human being. We can go back to the 1990s. We can go way before that. Philip Cutting, leading African historian, writing ghettoization of African history, for instance, and worrying that the racial criteria for appointing professors in US universities was not only lowering the standards, but actually he used the word ghettoizing the study of history in the US. And these periodic outbursts of actually extremely derogatory, unbelievable thinking about Africa and Africans has become sort of a periodic ritual that we do. Fortunately, the mobilization against some of this thinking is not exclusively racial. It's not that only Black people, Africans, are protesting against. It's a mobilization that carries a whole range of people who feel abused by the fact that in 2022, for instance, we will be going through similar rituals. But it's also a ritual that is informed by the fact that there is a sustainable basic structure that allows this to happen every other time. And the repeated invitations to debate those ideas that are extremely dehumanizing to our own thinking, that reduce us, send us back to the ghetto, if you want to use that word. The fact that we get invited into these rituals should be disturbing to all of us, should be disturbing, especially if in the desire to reconfigure African studies, we do not, at the end of the day, make sure that this does not become a periodic ritual that we have to engage in. And worse, in the response from African Studies Review editors, for instance, 3 things really disturbed me about their response. The first one was a reference to science and objectivity. The fact that the article has gone through a process of peer review and was judged credible. The ethical review processes were judged to be. You have to remember that this is the argument that Haskowitz was making in 1958 at the founding of African Studies. You have to remember that these are some of the arguments that we find in our own lecture rooms. The desire for objectivity, the emphasis on objectivity becomes the reason why things that are obviously never said about other people are done. The second thing that disturbed me about the response was a repeated emphasis on the fact that in the editorial board of this particular journal, there were Africans. Why would a bunch of Africans be complaining about this particular article that even the author began to admit was problematic on second thought? Why would a bunch of Africans be complaining about an article that was passed through a proper ethical process and published, including there being Africans on the board of the journal? Some of us have dealt with the political systems in Africa where there are a whole range of reasons why particular individuals associate themselves with what is otherwise not good for them. So to be able to say they are Africans, and to say, in addition, that there are Africans from the continent who have approved and participated in this was, in a sense, just not what one would expect. And perhaps finally, what is disturbing about this is that sense that, okay, we've had you, let's move on. Okay, let's just move on. And this particular story reproduces the same pattern that I have talked about, that I think is not very good. So let me.
Sorry to disturb you. I hope you are towards the end now, Godwin.
Yeah, my next sentence was, let me begin to wind down.
Okay.
Because I also forgot to ask how much time I have. I'm trying to to look at my stopwatch, and I notice I'm roughly at 48 minutes. So I wanted to begin to wind down by beginning to make the point that a notion of African studies that facilitates a reconfiguration of African studies as presently constituted needs to have Africans at the center of it. Needs to have Africans at the center of it. It needs to avoid reproducing inequalities that have been historically generated and grounded in the history of African studies, especially as we know it in North America. The European side is slightly different. It needs to avoid not just reproducing the inequalities, but also needs to avoid those silent strategies that are designed not just to keep people at the margins, but also to keep them as marginal participants in this engagement. It should be an idea of African studies that accepts genuine criticism and begins to understand that that genuine criticism is based on a desire to see ourselves represented in a manner that speaks really to not just the humanity we are, but actually the common humanity that we desire to have with every human being in the world. It is the reason why many of the alternatives to the notion of African studies continue to exist, not just side by side, but parallel to African studies as is practiced abroad. The recent experiment with the African studies of the UK under the presidency of Professor Ambrina Manji is one indicative way in which we can begin to break those boundaries. Why is it the case that almost all major conferences of African studies led by associations in Europe and in the US are done in Europe or in the US or in North America, to speak generally? And yet the Association for the Study of Africa and Asia has held I think the third conference since its founding in Dar es Salaam. I think the last one we were supposed to host in Dhaka and didn't work. I'm raising these questions to make this point in conclusion, that we need to rethink the agenda, but we need to go to the core of the power structure that makes it difficult for us to have productive engagement. And the allies who want to push this idea, I think, have an opportunity to begin to do this in the context of a desire to change almost completely how African studies is done, and re-engage alternative ways of thinking about Africa that continue to exist, have existed before African studies. So notions of creative insurgency, notions of epistemic justice, the value of the knowledge we produce, who produces it, and all that are going to be sitting at the center of it. And if we do that, we can begin to have an initial conversation about reconfiguring African studies in the way perhaps that the chair, Sabelo, and the team would want to imagine it. Let me stop there, and if there are any questions, I would see if I can attempt to respond to them. Sabelo, back to you.
Thank you so much, Godwin. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much. Right.
We are having a terrible echo in the system, so I can't really hear from my end.
Okay. It looks like mine. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for the critical issues which you raised, and we're really privileged to have this insight from you. And we want now to turn to Robert to chair the question and the response session.
I think your system is on mute. Robert, your mic is on mute.
So if I speak now, we will have a feedback.
Yes.
Is it possible now?
We have to mute this computer. Always.
Okay. So let's try this way. Yes, a bit low. Does it work now? Yeah.
You think so?
Can you hear me on the Zoom? Dr. Murunga, you can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. I will restart. So I would like to thank you very much for your presentation and your very dense description of these global inequalities that create this inequalities in knowledge production, and the long way and many tentatives to act against them, and that we have to rethink how to start it again. And it was really exciting what you presented, description of some of the mechanisms, how it works. So I'd like to open the floor for questions now. The floor in the Zoom, but the floor as well here in our room. So if you have questions and comments, please don't be shy. Show up, show your hand. And in the Zoom as well, you may show up with your camera, or raise an electronic hand, please. Yes, I see a first hand. Please, the floor is yours. Well, sorry, we had some technical issues, but we try to solve them in order to organize a free speech in this room. So please, yeah. Yes, sorry for that, but we had to solve some technical problems and we would like to come back to our discussion. So we have a first comment or question here in the room, please.
Thank you, Godwin, for such provocative talk. My name is Yusuf Serunkuma. I am from Makerere University in Kampala. And there are a couple of things I wanted to address with you, but maybe because of the technology I've cut them. I was very fascinated by your idea that we don't need to reconfigure African studies, which you said would be a conclusion. You said this at the beginning of your talk.
Yusuf, could you speak loudly, please?
I said I was really fascinated by the idea, the thesis that you spelled out for us when you said there's no need to reconfigure African studies. And then later in your talk, you spelled out sort of an exposition of what African studies had been constituted before, and you showed us that there are plenty of continuities. And I was curious to find out if you're able to think about the audiences of the African scholars, right? So as an African scholar, is it necessary for African scholars to contribute to knowledge in a sort of what you call the global north? Does it matter for an African scholar to contribute knowledge to the global north? And so this is I'm thinking in terms of audiences. Is an African scholar speaking to a global north audience relevant? Does it really matter for an African scholar to speak to that type of audience? Because the idea of African studies that it has a history. And we have at some point argued that this history is rooted in our colonial history. And if you can, as you've just demonstrated, there are plenty of continuities because of this history. So is it necessary? What is the point of an African scholar contributing knowledge to this type of audience? Because when you say later that we need to address the power structure, right? I'm curious to know what is this power structure? When you say to address the power structure, what is this power structure that you're talking about? And addressing it, what exactly do you mean? there's a point that he said we need to have African studies with Africans at the center. What is that supposed to mean with Africans at the center? Because you've just demonstrated with the example of the African Studies Review that even when the board had Africans, they couldn't query the article that got published on autoethnography. So when you say with African at the center, what do you mean? And I want to kind of switch a little back, is that whether if the Africans sort of delinked themselves from sort of a global commonwealth of scholarship, whether that won't be more relevant to them. If you speak to your audience as an African scholar, I think this is sort of in the Ngugi tradition, if you choose to speak to your audience, whether that won't be sufficient enough. And I think my problem is this aspiration for African scholars to imagine that if they speak to the global north, maybe relations between Africans, Africa and Europe, Euro-America will be better. Maybe the inequalities that was set in place by say structural adjustment could be better if Africans contributed sort of authentic, objective, or better understanding of who the Africans are. Perhaps the question there would be, what is? I think I've asked this question already. Maybe to just reiterate it. When African scholars aspire to contribute to what I'm calling the global commonwealth of knowledge, what is the import? What do they seek to benefit from this sort of space when they say they're going to contribute to this space? I don't know if the questions make sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Marunga, would you like to respond directly?
Yes, and thank you very much for the question. And let me just begin by saying this is really one of those most difficult issues to discuss. And I feel that we all have to first of all accept that knowledge is important. And the production of knowledge is important. And so the issue is not so much whether knowledge is important, whether we're having dialogue and conversations about Africa anywhere in the world. If you think about it, we have conversations about Europe and Europeans at any time, anywhere in the world. And it's normalized. It's normal to have those conversations. You don't, hear, and a colleague just published an article on this about 2-3 months ago in Codestria Bulletin. You don't hear anybody asking about the agency of British, Germans, and things like that. You hear about people worried about the agency of Africans. And so the point I really want to leave on the table is knowledge in itself, its production, the capacity to know, I think is key, central, and indisputable. And in many cases, we should even say whoever can produce knowledge about, wherever society, I think there shouldn't be any problem about that. The problem is twofold. One, that in the world commonwealth of knowledge, as you put it, the contribution of Africa and Africans is very limited. And we hardly ever really give sufficient attention to why it is very limited. And number two, because of the nature and structure of the production of knowledge about Africa, Africans are always finding themselves, number one, wondering whether they, in fact, are producers of knowledge that is legitimate, that is relevant, that is, a whole range of questions that we ask ourselves before we do it. But even more importantly, in a context where the dynamics of power, global dynamics of power, put us in a position where our humanity has been previously doubted, where our capacity to think has been previously doubted, where the colonial and neo-colonial instances have left legacies that push us into a sense of self-doubt. It becomes important that the reasons why we doubt and are doubted from producing knowledge become an issue of discussion. So to the point that the first point I make about the production of knowledge being important begins to assume a slightly different character, and this is the point that I have really struggled with in making my point. So, is it important for Africans to speak to audiences in the global north? I think that under normal circumstances, that should have been taken for granted. Just like a non-African speaking to Africa is often taken for granted, the reverse should also be taken for granted. That we don't take it for granted, I think for me, is the reason why we have to keep on reflecting about African studies and why African studies is important to this. And I have really just tried to shed light to the fact that at the end of the day, the reason why it doesn't sound normal for African to be producing knowledge and speaking to audiences in the North is a reflection of an asymmetry in the organization of the process of knowledge production that we need to think about and worry about. Okay, so hopefully I have responded to your question in some way, but really that's what I'm saying. That question that you are asking as to whether Africans can speak to audiences in the global north, that we asking that question reflects a problem within African studies that we have to deal with. Back to you, Chair.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Murunga, I think Yusuf would like to add something to his comment and question.
My question is why do you think it is necessary? Because Africa doesn't have a history of African studies. African studies originates from elsewhere. And every time you talk about knowledge production, you need to think about the audience. Knowledge production assumes an audience. And the assumption for African studies in the European and American context is that they're speaking to an audience. They have an audience in mind. And if you reflect on that audience in mind, in tandem with the history of African studies, they're speaking to an audience in a specific, particular way, and it's going to be biased. It's going to be an objective. It's going to represent a political position. So my question is this: the African aspiring to speak to that audience, what is their project? Because if we could go back a bit, colonialism did not end because you people in Europe understood Africa better. Neither did slave trade end because finally there was good knowledge about Africa, so slave trade had to end, right? If knowledge assumes its audience, what is the primary audience of an African scholar? My problem here is that I think it's the aspiration of African scholars to speak to global audiences in the sort of assuming that perhaps when knowledge is better understood, that they present a better picture to a European audience, then perhaps something good can come out of it. So in terms of our relations with Europe and South and North relations, and it's that which I find really problematic, because I think for me, this is what Ngugi was saying in Decolonizing the Mind, is that the scholar has to speak to his audience first, informing, generating consciousness, giving the compatriots discourse, so that they rise up and reform the space in which they live. I think African scholars have ignored this primary concern of a scholar in the aspiration to speak to a global commonwealth, forgetting that this commonwealth is designed and structured to speak to a particular audience. and that audience cannot be reformed by, say, maybe better or neutral or more objective knowledge. That audience has interest already embedded in it that they can only constantly pursue their interest. Yeah, I hope that's.
Tumurunga, please.
Okay, no. Yusuf, now I hope that I have understood your question, and that I can perhaps slightly, I can shed light to the thinking that I have with you. I think you pairing knowledge production with an audience, and you are centering the audience as key to how knowledge is received, appreciated, and used, if I'm getting you right. And actually, the assumption I made in my presentation was that all along, Africans have been producing knowledge with audiences of diverse nature, and that in the overall scheme of things, we actually still continue to produce knowledge with a set of audiences that are diverse. And the European one, what you're calling the global commonwealth of knowledge, is just but one of the audiences that African academics who produce knowledge are looking at. More often than not, our audience is actually a lot more inward looking. We're looking more inward than outward. It's just this morning that I was attending a meeting at which Professor Akila Pasoya, the former Vice Chancellor of University of Ghana, Legon, but also former Director of the African Association of Universities, was speaking. And a reference was made to the years around 1985 into the 1990s, when the African University as an institution of knowledge production was undermined through the fiscal challenges that they experienced at the time. And through Codesri, I happen to know now that it was precisely at the moment when the structure adjustments programs hit Africa so hard that the University of Zimbabwe produced perhaps the enormous amount of publications. Codesria did lead a project of producing knowledge, and because we were so disconnected from the rest of the world, given the challenges we were facing, a lot of our audience was actually local. So I hear you about the importance and centrality of the global commonwealth that you speak about, but I think you may be underestimating how much knowledge production and how much knowledge production is happening largely on the continent, but also how much that is geared towards addressing a local constituency. One of the recent work that we're beginning to do at Codesra in collaboration with roughly 10 institutions across the continent has been to work around indigenous knowledge, both indigenous knowledge and endogenous knowledge. And as we conducted our review and all that, it is surprising how much of these conversations have actually been happening on the continent in spite of and irrespective of this global commonwealth that you are talking about. So I hear you on the point about the repeated desire for Africans to speak to the global audience, but I think let us not forget that these conversations actually do happen on an everyday basis in a whole range of places without necessarily worrying a little too much about the global in the manner in which you have suggested. Back to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for more questions or comments. We have a question here. A question or comment?
Yeah, I would like just to ask a very short question about the relevance of African studies finally. Is it currently at contributing to the construction of the idea of Africa, or is it meant to contribute to understand the challenges that African country is facing now? That is the question.
Do you mind just repeating that? Sorry, I missed out the first part of your question.
Yeah, I would like just to have your thought about the relevance of African studies. Like, is it meant to contribute to the construction of the idea of Africa, or to better understand the challenges that Africa continent is facing?
I would actually say both. In its design, it's meant to do a whole range of things, both in terms of understanding the continent, understanding the experience of Black people, not just in Africa, but across the world. But secondly, also in terms of understanding the challenges that face it. And I would really like to restate the point that I really would like to think about it as about the value of knowledge. I think that the challenge we often face when we're thinking about Africa is the addition of the fact Africa to knowledge. I think there is a general value for knowledge, the value for knowing, the value of constructing an archive that facilitates a better understanding of society in general. But I think that in my thinking, in my assessment, it's really not a question of whether it is understand the continent or relevance and all that. I think it is both, and I would say that for me is the pivot I would use in thinking about the value of African studies in whichever way it is projected, be it in the problematic ways or in other alternative ways. I think the value of knowledge is central to this.
Thank you very much. Okay, you're fine with the answer. I don't see any hand raised in the Zoom. Are there more questions or comments? Okay. So if this is not the case, yes, finally, I see Ibrahim Bashir. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your great talk. I really enjoyed. My question is very short. I would like to ask you about the new concept that, like, for example, the Reconfiguring African Studies, this kind of new concept that emerged, like, to, let's say, to revolutionize the African studies. Do you see all these efforts as a positive contribution to really transform, if I can call it, not configuration of African studies, or it can be seen as a negative, or it can have a negative contribution, if I can call it. Like, for example, in the West, we are seeing these concepts are more likely coming from Western, what we are criticizing at the same time. So it is a way to change the narratives by keeping doing the same things, or do I see it as a positive effort? Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much for the question. I think that if you let me take the example of one of the leading, quote unquote, leading journals of African studies, African Affairs, which is published out of the UK. And if you pick the very first issues of African Affairs, published as early as 1901, all the way to around 1910. And then, get into 1960, 1970. The very early issues of African Affairs as a journal, they were basically reflections of colonial administrators, colonial anthropologists, explorers, if you will, people who wanted to document their experiences of what Africa was, framed from a very, not just colonial, but also from a very, if you will, amateur sort of perspective. Now, over the years, you look at the journal and you see it repeatedly seeking to address itself to the criticisms that are coming from the field. And some of these criticisms are coming from within Europe itself, from North America, the global North in general, but some of them are actually coming from within Africa. And forcing a rethinking of the set of assumptions that informed the idea of Africa that they were publishing. Same thing can be said about associations. Same thing can be said about networks. Something can be said about, the curriculum in universities and all that. And the point I'm trying to make there is that any reform that is associated with these criticisms, with this reform, any reform that is associated with this criticism is valuable in terms of forcing a rethinking of the representation of Africa. Right, it makes for good outcomes if at all it's done as genuinely as one hopes. So that is not for me in question. I think what is worrying is that first of all, the rate of reform is slow. Number one, it is grudging. Number two, and essentially is controlled, if you will, okay? In a context where the rest of the world is moving much faster. So if you want to understand some of the movements that have informed say the Far-East movements, Rhodes Must Fall, and all these movements, the decolonization movement, some of these things are essentially a reaction at the pace at which these reforms are taking place. Now, the interesting point that I feel needs to be mentioned is that at the end of the day, how the rest of the world deals with Africa depends on what they know about the continent. Okay, and that is central to the whole story of not just African studies, but also how the world structures its relationship with the continent. And in my view, what is important is not so much that reforms are happening, it is that the pace of reform has to change significantly and address the core of the challenges that make it difficult for us to begin to re-engage in Africa in a manner that is inclusive, in a manner that is representative of the core of the thinking and the experiences that African peoples across the world live. So, direct answer to you, the reforms are good. We need more. I guess that's the point I'm trying to advance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I'm talking from the
Yes, I
loudspeaker
think
in the room.
the speakers,
Are on now.
they are on now.
Okay.
Thank you for this answer, Dr. Morunga. The floor is still open for other questions or remarks. And if this is not the case, and there's nobody else who would like to raise his hand, I would give the floor to Sabelo Lovukacheli for some closing remarks.
I'm not always good with closing remarks. I end up presenting another paper. Let me avoid that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Godwin, for the clear pointed interventions, and it is very useful for us here who are working with this rubric of reconfiguring African studies, and your critical comments are well taken. Thank you so much, and we value your time, and also that is not only you speaking, is also Cordesria speaking. That actually adds more to what we've given us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Dr. Morunga, for the presentation, for the discussion. I think it's good use to announce the next lecture of the series, which will take place the 24th November at 5 p.m. South African time and Central European time. And it's will be held by Professor Akosua Adumakwa Mpofu from Ghana, who is their Professor of African and Gender Studies at the University of Ghana. And the topic of her speech is about African citizenship and the ownership of material and intellectual cultures. So you are warmly invited to attend this lecture as well. I would like to wish you a nice evening and see you again at the next lecture in November. Thank you very much.